There is an argument. Elira had made it herself more than once, usually to the inside of a cold cup of willow tea, that none of what came after was ever really her doing. If the King of Ardenmoor had been even a little less determined to get himself killed, she'd never have been called down to the mercy that night. And if the men who kept trying to kill him had been even slightly better at their work, they'd have finished the job years earlier and spared her the trouble of ever meeting him at all. So when you followed the whole tangled business back to its beginning, thread by thread, it was really, when you thought about it honestly, entirely his fault, every last knot of it. She would have a great deal of time, later, to think about that. Elira was a healer, and before that she had been a war medic on the Ashfin line, which meant she had two settings, calm and asleep. She did not flinch at blood or bone, or the particular gray a face went in the hour before it stopped being a face at all. The other apprentices at the Mercy said she had ice in her instead of marrow, and Elira let them say it, because a healer whose hands shook was no healer, and hers never had. Master Ansel, who'd pulled her half-starved out of a burned border town at 11, had taught her the first rule before any other. The body doesn't care how you feel about it, steady hands or nothing. So when the great doors of the Mercy came off their latch at the black end of the night, and 6 of the royal guard staggered in, carrying something that snarled, Elira did not gasp then either. She did notice it was the king. You could not really fail to notice. King Severin of Ardenmoor was on every coin she'd ever counted, and even flat on a stretcher with his shirt cut open and his teeth bared, he was unmistakably himself, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, putting off the low, pressing weight of a true alpha, the kind that made her own wolf lie down flat inside her skin. A crossbow bolt was buried to the fletching under his collarbone, and the wood of it had gone black, and the black was creeping. "Silvered," Ansel said, already at the table sleeves shoved up, and something on the tip. "Wolfsbane, or worse. Hold him?" They tried. 6 grown guardsmen tried to hold one wounded man, and could not. An alpha king in the deep of the red hours, the mortal pain that takes a wolf past sense, past speech, into something that will kill whatever it can reach, is not a patient. He is a storm with a heartbeat. He threw the first guard into a cabinet of jars. The second he caught by the wrist, and Elira heard the bone go. And Ansel stood there with the pincers, a hand's breadth from that blackening wound, and could not close the distance, because the moment anyone reached for the bolt, the king's arm came round like a felled tree. "He'll die," Ansel said. Not to anyone. "The bane's at the vein. If I can't cut in the next minute, he'll die on this table." Nobody moved. Nobody in that room was fool enough to put a hand on a thrashing sovereign. You could hang for far less than that, for laying so much as a finger on the crown uninvited, and everyone in the Mercy knew it. Elira, God's help her, put down her cloth, stepped past 2 men twice her size, climbed half onto the table at his side, and took the king's hand in both of hers. She did not really decide to. That was the truth of it, the part she could never afterward explain. Her body simply went, the way it had gone 100 times on the Ashfin line, toward the next screaming boy, because the alternative was to stand and watch a man die within reach of her hands, and she had never once in her life been able to do that. His grip crushed down on hers hard enough to grind the small bones of her fingers together, and she let it. She leaned in over him, close to the fever heat rolling off his skin, and she did the only thing she had ever known to do. "There you are," she said, low and even, the voice she kept for the ones who weren't going to make it, and the ones who might. "I have you. I'm not going anywhere. Squeeze as hard as you like. You can't hurt me. I promise you can't. Just hold on to me and let the man work. Hold on to me. There. Good. Just here, just this." Whether it was the words, or the touch, or only that some drowning animal part of him found one steady thing in all that fire and seized it, the storm did not stop, but it turned. His head rolled toward her voice. His breathing found the shape of hers. And in the half-second his arm went slack around her instead of around the wound. Ansel drove the pincers in and drew the black bolt out clean, and the king made a sound she felt in her own teeth. And then the poison fight was on, and it was a long, ugly hour, and none of it was gentle. But he lived, gray and soaked and shaking. The bane bled and burned out of him. He lived. And when it was over, when the wound was packed, and the worst of it had passed, and every healer in the room finally let out the breath they'd been holding, Elira went to take her hands back. His fingers had locked around hers, not the wild grip of the red hours now. Something quieter, and somehow far worse for it. She pulled, gently, then less gently. Iron. A sleeping man, half dead an hour ago, holding onto her hand like it was the last rung of a ladder over a very deep dark. "Your Majesty," she murmured, absurdly, "you can let go now. It's done. You're safe." His eyes opened, pale, fever-bright, and far too clear for a man who by rights should not have been awake at all. They found her face out of the whole crowded room and settled there and did not so much as flicker. He looked at her the way you look at something you have been waiting a very long time for. His mouth moved. "There you are," he said. The exact words she'd said to him, as though he'd been the one waiting, as though he knew her. And before Elira could make any sense of it, before she could ask what he meant, or how, the captain of the royal guard had her by the arm and was hauling her back off the dais, and the whole hall had gone white and silent, and somewhere a physician was already saying the word presumption, and the king's hand, even as she was dragged out of reach, opened after hers, as though it did not understand why she was leaving. Elira woke the next morning to full daylight and the immediate, ironclad conviction that she had ruined her life. She lay in her narrow cot in the apprentice's loft above the Mercy, and stared at the rafters and let the night come back to her in pieces. The black bolt, the fever, the crushing grip, there you are, and each piece was worse than the last. She had, in front of half the royal guard and every healer in the house, laid both her bare hands on the sovereign of Ardenmoor, while he was out of his senses, uninvited, unranked, a war orphan and a junior healer who was not fit to be in the same room as the crown, let alone wrapped around its hand. There were men rotting in the cells under the Grey Keep for touching the king's horse. "You're awake." Tamsin was leaning in the doorway with her arms folded, and behind her hovered Wick, who at 19 still had the face of a boy who has never once successfully hidden bad news. "Good. We weren't sure you'd remember any of it." "You win a bit." Tamsin turned one hand in the air gray. "After I remember." Elira sat up. Her right hand ached to the wrist. She could still feel the shape of his fingers in it. "I remember enough. Tell me the king's alive, at least so it wasn't for nothing." "Oh, he's alive." That was Wick. Too quick, too bright. "He's very alive." That's rather the... Tamsin's elbow found his ribs, and he stopped. Elira looked between them. What? Neither of them wanted to say it. That more than anything put the cold finger down her spine. Because Tamsin was the sharpest tongue in the Mercy, and never once in 3 years had Elira seen her lost for a cruel word, and here she was chewing the inside of her cheek like a girl at a funeral. "He won't let the royal physicians near him," Tamsin said finally. 3 of them, best in Ardenmoor. He put them out of the room before dawn. Says the wound's fine. Says," she stopped again, "says he'll be seen to by the one who held on." Those were his words, apparently. "The one who held on. He's asked for you twice." That's Elira's mouth had gone dry. That's not he was raving. He doesn't know what he's saying. That's the trouble, isn't it? Tamsin pushed off the doorframe and came to sit on the end of the cot, and lowered her voice, which was worse. "Elira, you know the old talk, the red hours. What they say happens when someone anchors an alpha through them. That's a nursery story. Half the court believes that nursery story." Tamsin held her eyes, the hold bond. "You take a wolf through mortal pain, keep him tethered when his own mind's let go. The old wives say you knot your soul to his coming out the other side. Some say it's a blessing, some say it's a claim. And some, she paused, say a nobody who lays hands on a dying king and comes away knotted to him has done the most dangerous thing a person in your position can possibly do, whether she meant to or not. Because now you're either the woman who saved him or the woman who got her hooks in him while he couldn't say no, and the court hasn't decided which yet. Neither has the king's council, and until somebody decides, she didn't finish. She didn't have to. Master Ansel came up the loft stairs then, and one look at his face emptied the room. Wick and Tamsin were gone before he'd reached the top. He was a big, gentle, gray-bearded mountain of a man, the closest thing to a father Elira had ever had, and she had seen him set a compound fracture without blinking and talk a plague ward through its worst night without once losing his calm. He was not calm now. He looked, standing in the low light with his hands working against each other, simply and openly afraid. "Tell me you did not," he said quietly. "Put your hands on King Severin. He was dying, Ansel. You said it yourself. A minute more, and I know what I said." He closed his eyes. "God's girl. I know. You did what I trained you to do. You did the right thing, and I'd not take it back." He came and sat heavily, where Tamsin had sat, and took her aching hand in both of his, careful, the way she'd taken the king's. "But right things and safe things aren't the same, and you've never once known the difference, and it terrifies me. There are people in that keep who will not care that you saved him. They'll only care what it looks like. And it looks like a low-born healer put a hold on the king. Then I'll tell them the truth. It was a bolt and a poison and a pair of steady hands, nothing more. There's no bond. I don't feel anything." She meant it. She'd felt nothing but a dying man's grip and her own thundering heart. "I'll explain, and they'll see sense, and it'll be finished." Ansel opened his mouth to answer. The bell over the Mercy's gate began to ring. Not the low, single toll for a delivery, or the double for an injured man brought in. This was the high, bright, urgent ring of an arrival that mattered, and Ansel's head came up like a hound's, and through the window below Elira heard boots on the stones, a lot of them, in step, and the voice of the house steward, gone suddenly high and formal. "That's a royal escort," Ansel said very low, "at my gate, and nobody sent word." The boots came up through the building, unhurried, certain, and stopped outside the loft door. They had not come from the Grey Keep to explain anything to her. They had come to take her to it. They did not, in the end, throw Elira in a cell, though she spent the entire ride up to the Grey Keep braced for exactly that. Instead, they gave her a room with a window. A good room, high in the east tower, with a real bed and a basin and a chair by the fire, and a guard on the door who called her madam in a voice that could not decide whether she was a prisoner or a guest, which, she was beginning to understand, was precisely the problem. Nobody in the whole keep seemed to know what she was, so they had put her somewhere clean and locked the door and waited for someone far above them to decide. It was near dusk when someone did. The door opened without a knock, and King Severin of Ardenmoor walked into the room, and the air changed. She'd known he was the king. She had held his hand while he screamed. But the man on the table in the red hours and the man in the doorway now were barely the same creature. This one was upright, dressed in dark gray and no crown at all. His arm bound in a sling she recognized as her own master's work, and even wounded, even pale under the brown of his skin, he filled the room the way weather fills a valley. Her wolf came to attention beneath her ribs without being asked. She made herself stand very straight and not look away, which cost more than she would ever have admitted. "There she is," he said, "my healer, your majesty." She dropped to one knee, because that at least she knew how to do. "I owe you an apology and an explanation, and I'd rather give both than have them dragged out of me. Last night I laid hands on you without leave. I know what that is. I know what it's cost better men, but you were dying under my master's pincers, and I could not stand and watch it. And her jaw tightened, "I'd do it again. I won't pretend I wouldn't, even to save my own neck. There's no bond. Whatever the house is whispering, there's no claim. I held a dying man's hand, and he lived. That's the whole of it. Punish me for the presumption if you must, but leave the crown out of a story that hasn't got one. For a moment he simply looked down at her, and she could not read a single thing in it. Then he crossed the room, and to her total astonishment, crouched, carefully, favoring the arm, until they were nearly level, so that a king was down on the floor of a tower room with a war orphan, and said gently, "You've a truly remarkable talent for confessing to crimes no one has charged you with. Do sit in a chair, you're making my knees hurt on your behalf." She sat. She did not know what else to do. Now. He lowered himself into the chair opposite, slow, and she saw the flash of white at the corners of his mouth that meant the arm still cost him with every movement. "The council would like very much to hang you. Some of them think you're a Varn assassin who lost her nerve. Some of them think you're a peasant girl who saw a chance and got her hands on a king who couldn't fend her off. And the loudest of them think you've laid an old dangerous hold on me and mean to steer the crown by it." He tilted his head. "You'll be relieved to hear I've disappointed all three. Your Majesty, I've named you my personal healer." He said it lightly, the way you'd mention the weather as of this morning. "My hand, the household calls it. You'll attend the king's wounds and the king's health and no one else's, and you'll answer to me and to no council. And any man who wants to hang you will first have to explain to me why he wants my physician dead with a Varn poison still working its way out of my blood." The easy smile again. "It solves a great many problems at once. You're too useful to hang and too watched to scheme. Everyone can stop losing sleep." Alira stared at him. "You can't. I'm a junior healer. I'm nobody. There are 3 royal physicians in this keep who couldn't get within arm's reach of me last night without being thrown across a room," he said. And for just a breath, something flickered under the charm, something tired and older than his face. "You could. You did. I'd rather that stayed close, wouldn't you say?" It was a good answer. That was the trouble. It was such a good answer that she almost missed the shape of the thing underneath it. That he had given her 3 reasons and not one of them was the true one. And that a man who ruled the kingdom did not personally climb a tower and crouch on a stone floor to reassure a healer. "Why me?" she said slowly. "Truly, not the council reasons. Why does the king of Ardenmoor care who dresses his arm?" And there, for half a heartbeat, she saw it. His eyes went to her hand, the right one, the one that still ached from his grip, and something crossed his face that she had no name for, quick and gone. Then the smile came back down over it like a visor. "Get some sleep, Alira," he said, rising, and she noticed he already knew her name, though she'd never given it. "You'll want it. You start tomorrow." He paused at the door. "And do stop kneeling. It doesn't suit either of us." He was gone before she could answer, and only once the latch had clicked did she realize her heart was going far too fast, and that she still had no idea what he was hiding, and that somewhere below in that vast gray keep, a poison was still moving quietly through the veins of the most powerful man in the realm, and that come morning, keeping it from killing him had somehow become her job. Being the king's hand, Alira quickly learned, was mostly waiting. She had expected an ogre, or at the least a tyrant who summoned her to be admired and dismissed. What she got was a wound that would not close, and a man who asked her far too many questions. She'd come to change the dressing, and he'd want to know where she'd learned to pack a poison track so it drained instead of festering, and she'd tell him. The Ashfen line, a field tent, a surgeon with 3 fingers and no patience, and instead of the royal boredom she braced for, he'd lean in, wince at his own arm, and ask another. "What was it like? How many did you lose? What do you do with your hands when there's nothing left to do with them?" Nobody had ever asked Alira that last one before. She didn't have a good answer, and he didn't fill the silence for her, which she found she minded less than she should have. "You keep waiting for me to be cruel to you. he said one gray afternoon watching her thread a needle by the window. "It's rather sad to watch. Who taught you kings were cruel?" "Kings did," she said, without looking up, and he laughed, a real one, surprised out of him, nothing like the smooth thing he wore for the council, and she felt the corner of her own mouth betray her before she caught it. He took to following her after that. When she went down to the keep's own guard infirmary to look in on the soldier whose wrist he'd broken in the Red Hours, a young man named Holden, who bore the king no grudge and was terrified of him all the same, Severin came too, uninvited, and stood in the doorway of a place kings do not go, and watched her splint and gentle a frightened boy back to calm. Afterward he asked quietly how many such rooms there were in his own house that he'd never once walked into. "All of them," she told him. He did not like the answer. She was beginning to notice he never flinched from the answers he didn't like, which was more than she could say for most of the highborn she'd ever bled. But she was a medic before she was anything, and a medic's eye does not switch off for charm. And what her eye kept telling her, day after day, was that the arm was wrong. It should have been closing. She'd drawn the bolt clean. Ansel had bled the bane. By every rule she knew, the flesh should be knitting pink and dull by now. Instead, the edges stayed hot, the skin around them faintly gray, and twice in 10 days the red hours came back on him in smaller waves. Never the full storm of that first night, but enough that she'd find him white-lipped and rigid in his chair, gripping the arm of it hard enough to split the wood. The second time, she did what she'd sworn to herself she wouldn't do again. She took his hand. It was different, sober. That was the thing no nursery story had warned her about. On the table he'd been past knowing. Here he was entirely present, lucid, his pale eyes fixed on her face while she laced her fingers through his and murmured him down out of the pain, the way she'd have talked down any soldier, except this soldier was watching her mouth as she did it. Neither of them let go for a long moment, longer than the pain could account for. Somewhere below, a bell rang the hour, and neither of them marked it. His thumb moved once, slow, across her knuckles, testing or thanking. She couldn't have said which, and she watched the last of the pain drain out of his face and thought, with the clear, flat panic of a woman who has just noticed the floor is not where she left it, that she was in a very great deal of trouble. "You're very good at that," he said quietly. "I've had practice." She made herself take her hand back. It cost her something to do it, and she resented that it did. "Your Majesty, this shouldn't still be happening. The bolt's out. There's no source left in you for the bane to feed on. A wound like this closes, or it kills you. It doesn't sit and smolder for a fortnight. Bodies don't do that. Perhaps I'm simply built stubborn. No." She was already turning back to her kit, the medic in her 3 steps ahead of the rest of her, laying out the little jars, the salve, the wash, the tonic Ansel sent up fresh each morning from the Mercy, for the king's blood. She uncorked the tonic, and for no reason but the itch of a thing not adding up, she did what she'd have done to any doubtful draft in a field tent. She wet a finger, touched it to her tongue, and held it there, bitter. Beneath the honey and the willow, a thin, bitter, familiar edge, low at the back of the throat, the taste of a thing she had spent a war learning to recognize so that no boy on her table ever drank it by accident. Wolfsbane. Fresh wolfsbane. In the tonic she'd been spooning into the King of Ardenmoor with her own hand, twice a day, for 10 days. The wound wasn't failing to heal. Someone was making sure it never could. Alira set the little jar down very carefully on the sill, as though it might go off, and found that her steady hands were not for once entirely steady, because there was only one place that tonic was made, and only one house it came from, and it came sealed, and it came trusted, and it came from the Mercy, from Ansel's own stores. She stood at the sill a long time while the light failed, turning the little jar the way she turn a wound to find the depth of it. It made no sense, and it made perfect sense at once. The tonic came sealed from the Mercy every dawn. She had watched Ansel refuse, on principle, to send out so much as a cough draft he hadn't blended with his own 2 hands, which left her exactly 2 roads, and she hated the look of both. Either someone was getting to the king's cup, somewhere between her master's bench and this chamber, or her master's own hands had put the bane in it and sent it up the hill with a seal and a blessing. She thought of Ansel hauling her half-dead out of the ash when she was 11. She thought of 13 years of patient, steady teaching, the only steady thing she'd ever had. And then, because she was honest even when it gutted her, she made herself think the second thought all the way to its end, and then set about, very quietly, to prove it wrong. She did not, that first night, accuse anyone of anything. A war medic learns early that the loudest theory is usually the wrong one, and that a person who shouts poison in a king's household had better be certain, because there is no taking the word back once it's in the air. So she did what she was good at. She watched. She switched the tonic quietly for a clean wash of her own making and told no one. She counted the days and marked how the gray went out of his skin without it. She began keeping a little book of who came and went from the royal chambers, who carried the trays, whose hands touched the cup before hers. And she said nothing to the king, because she told herself she had nothing yet but a taste and a suspicion, and because a small, cold voice underneath that reason asked whether the king was quite as ignorant of all this as he pretended. The trouble was that the more closely she watched him for danger, the more she simply found herself watching him. It crept up on her like a low fever. In 100 ordinary moments, she couldn't afterward put in order. The way he'd argue with her over a dressing, purely to hear her lose her temper. The way on the cold nights he took to walking the east rampart with her under the excuse of air, and brought 2 cups of spiced milk, and handed hers over so that his fingers brushed the backs of her knuckles, and she'd feel it clear up to the shoulder and spend the next hour furious about it. She'd ask him a sharp question: who wants you dead, and why, and how long have you known? And he'd answer that she was uncommonly beautiful when she was suspicious, and slide 3 topics sideways before she noticed he'd never answered at all. She told herself it was the poison, that watching him this closely was simply the job. But the job did not explain why she'd started reading the gray at his temple that meant a bad night before he'd said a word, or why, when a visiting lord laughed a beat too long at some remark of the king's and laid a ringed hand on his sleeve, Alira had felt her own lip curl before she'd caught it. That last one frightened her more than the wolfsbane did. The wolfsbane, at least, she knew how to draw back out. "You're doing it again," she said one night on the rampart, the city a scatter of gold below them. "The thing where you talk and say nothing. I say a great many things. You say everything except the one true thing." She turned to face him. "I've never once heard you tell me a fact about yourself. I couldn't have read off a coin." He was quiet a moment, the wind pulling at his hair, and something in his face loosened. She thought, "There, now here it comes," and leaned toward it without meaning to. "The one true thing," he said softly, and looked at her, really looked, "is that I sleep better on the nights you're in the room. I've not slept a whole night in 3 years. I don't much care to tell you why." His voice had gone low and plain and entirely without its usual armor, and she felt the words go straight through her ribs and lodge. Is that fact enough to be going on with? Healer? That was the danger of it. It was such a good, quiet, unguarded answer that she nearly told him everything. The bane, the tonic, the little book right there on the wall. She didn't, and she was glad she didn't. An hour later, because she'd gone back for the kit she'd left in his study and the door was ajar, and the king, who could not sleep and could barely lift his arm, was standing at the far window with no pain in him at all, straight-backed, still, deadly quiet, speaking low to the captain of his guard. She stopped in the dark of the corridor. She did not breathe. Then, "It's someone inside the Mercy," Severin was saying, in a voice she had never once heard him use, flat and cold and certain, "someone she trusts." Which is exactly why she can't know yet. A pause. Say nothing to her, Corin. Not a word. If I'm right about who it is, it will break her, and I'll not have it broken a day before I have to her. He meant her. Alira stood in the black corridor with her heart going like a hammer, and understood two things at once, and could not decide which frightened her more: that the king had known there was a poisoner in the Mercy long before she'd tasted it, and that the helpless dying man she'd been falling asleep in the same room with had been performing every hour of it, watching her the whole time, keeping some enormous and terrible thing from her, for her own good. She should have felt only the betrayal of it. Instead, standing there in the cold with her back to the stone, she felt the two halves of him try and fail to fit together: the tired man on the rampart, who slept better when she was near, and this cold, certain hunter at the window who'd been running her like a hound on a scent. She backed away a careful step at a time, the way you leave a room with a wounded animal still in it, and she did not sleep at all that night. By morning, she had a decision, if not an answer. She would stop being the king's blind hand. Whatever it was he knew, she would learn it herself, his way, in the dark watching, and when at last she understood the shape of the thing being kept from her, she would decide then, and only then, who in this gray keep had earned her trust and who had merely been borrowing it. She meant to have it out with him. She had a whole cold speech, built by the time she carried in his dressings the next evening. "You've been lying to me. You're no more dying than I am. Tell me what you know, or find yourself another hand." And she got exactly as far as setting the tray down before it all fell apart in her mouth. Because he looked up at her, and the performance wasn't there. He looked in the low lamplight of his own chamber, with no council, and no captain, and no crowd, to be a king for. Simply tired. Tired all the way down. And when she stood there with her arms folded and her speech dying, he said, before she could start, "You've found me out, haven't you? I can see it on your face. You've a terrible face for secrets. Has anyone told you? Go on then. Be angry. I'd rather your anger than your good opinion. At least the anger's real. You're not sick." Her voice came out rougher than she wanted. "You've been letting me believe. Every night I've sat up thinking I was watching a man die." "You were." He said it quietly, and rolled the loose sleeve up, and there was the wound, still red at the edges, still refusing. "That part was never a lie. Someone has spent 3 years trying to put me in the ground an inch at a time, and some nights they've come very close, and the only thing on this earth that pulls me back out of the fire when they do." He stopped and looked at his own ruined arm, and then at her, "and the last of the armor came down, is you. That isn't a scheme, Elira. I wish to the gods it were a scheme I could put down. This, I can't." He told her a little of it, then in the flat, even voice men use for the wounds that have stopped bleeding and simply ache. His father dead when he was 19, the crown dropped on him while he was still half a boy. An uncle who smiled at every council and sold him quietly to Housevarn beneath the table. 3 years of cups gone bitter, and saddle girths split, on the hunt and footing that gave way on stairs he'd climbed 1,000 times. He'd stopped trusting his food, he'd stopped trusting sleep. He had learned instead to perform an entire, easy, untroubled king every waking hour, so that no one, not the court, not the killers, not the frightened ordinary people who needed him to look steady, would ever see how near the edge he actually walked. "You learn to live behind glass," he said. And then one night, a healer with ice for blood climbs up onto my table and holds my hand and talks to me like I'm a man and not a throne. And the glass, he lifted his good shoulder and winced at the other. The glass cracks. It's dreadfully inconvenient. I've been furious about it for a fortnight. She should have held on to the anger. She'd earned it. But she'd spent a war reading faces for the exact moment a man stopped hiding, and she was looking at it now, and there was no strategy anywhere in it. Only a man who had been strong and alone and afraid for a very long time, and had just set all 3 down in front of her because he was too tired to carry them another step. Why keep it from me? She said, softer. Because when I know who it is, I'll have to tell you, he said. And you'll never look at me the same after. So I've been selfish. Keeping the version of you that still looks at me like this a little longer. He tried for the old smile, and didn't quite reach it. I'm not a good man, whatever the coins say. I'm only a tired one, who'd very much like you, to stay in the room. She crossed to him, without deciding to. Her hand came up and found the side of his face, and he went still under it the way he had that first night, and she watched the tiredness crack straight down the middle. I'm in the room, she said. He caught her hand against his cheek and turned his mouth into her palm. And something that had been pulled tight in both of them for a fortnight let go all at once. When he drew her down and kissed her, it was slow and certain and entirely without the crown in it, his good hand sliding into her hair, and every careful, watchful thing in Alira went quiet for the first time in longer than she could remember. There was no counsel, no poison, no little book of names. There was the lamplight and the warmth of him, and the plain, astonishing fact that a man wanted her, not her hands, not her use. Her, and she let herself, for once in her life, simply have it. His good arm came around her and drew her in, careful, even now. Careful. The way she had learned that everything about him was careful, and she felt the steady thunder of his heart under her palm. For a moment, there was nothing in the whole gray keep but the two of them and the astonishing, unfamiliar quiet of not standing guard over herself. And then, with her heart wide open and her guard entirely down, it happened. It came through the place where they touched, the palm, still against his face, his hand at her jaw, a flood of feeling that poured into her and was not, unmistakably was not, her own. Relief, vast and drowning, fear, worn smooth with age. A want so raw it frightened her, and underneath it all, threaded through everything, a bone-deep, grinding weariness that she recognized because she'd been carrying it in her own chest for a fortnight without knowing whose it was. She could feel him, his actual heart, distinct and clear and foreign, laid open against hers. Alira wrenched back with a gasp, her hand flying off his skin as though it had burned her, and stared at him from arm's length with her breath sawing and her whole certain world tilting on its edge, because the hold bond was a nursery story. She'd said so, she'd staked her neck on it in a tower room. There's no claim. And Severine was staring back at her with his pale eyes blown wide, and she knew from his face, from the shock naked all over it, that he had felt it too. For a long moment neither of them moved. The bond hummed in the air between them like a plucked string, and Alira could still feel the ghost of his heartbeat laid over her own, and it frightened her more than any blade ever had. Because a blade, she understood. A blade you saw coming. This was a door blown open in her chest that she had never agreed to open, a stranger's whole soul suddenly close enough to touch, and every instinct a hard life had built in her said that a thing this large could only ever be a thing that was taken away. That wasn't nothing. His voice had gone rough. He took a step toward her, his good hand lifting as though he might reach through the space between them and prove it real. Alira, you felt it? I felt you feel it. It was a kiss. The words came out flat and cold. The war medic's voice, the one she'd used to lie to dying boys about how bad it was. That's all it was. A kiss and a long fortnight, and two tired people with no sleep between them. It wasn't, whatever you're about to name it, it wasn't that. He stopped. She watched the hope drain out of his face the way water drains from a cracked basin, and she hated herself. And she did not take it back, because taking it back meant believing in it, and believing in it meant she had, at last, something she could lose. Right, he said, after a moment, very quietly. Of course. A kiss. And the smooth king slid back down over the tired man like a visor lowering, and she had done that. She had put it there, and it sat worse in her than any wound she'd ever failed to close. She'd spent a lifetime keeping the safe distance. It was the first thing the war had taught her, and the last thing she'd never quite unlearned. You did not let yourself love the ones on your table, because half of them died, and a healer who broke every time was no use to the next one. She had built her whole self around that rule, brick by careful brick, and here was a man asking her to pull it all down for him on the strength of a feeling that had come through her own skin uninvited, and she could not do it. She would not. She would sooner call the truest thing she had ever felt a kiss, and be done, and stay standing. She should have known the poison would choose that night to make its move. She'd switched his tonic 10 days before and told no one, and for 10 days the gray had gone out of him and the wound had begun at last to knit. She had thought it a victory. She understood, far too late, that it had been a provocation, that whoever had spent 3 patient years killing this man an inch at a time had felt their poison fail and understood that someone in the house had found them out. And they did not stay patient after that. It was past the deep of the night when her door banged open and Wick stood there, white as tallow. "The king, it's the king. Come, he's," and she was running before he finished the sentence, down the cold halls in her shift. She heard it before she reached the doors. Not a cry, for a king does not cry out, but the low, tearing sound of a great animal spending the very last of its strength. The red hours had him, and this was no small wave. This was that first night doubled and set alight. He'd already thrown 2 guards. There was blood on his mouth where he'd bitten clean through his own lip, and blood black through the bandage where the half-healed wound had torn wide again, and when his eyes rolled toward her, they were not seeing anything at all. "Out," she told the room, "all of you now," and they went. Because a person who sounds that certain is obeyed, and then it was only her and the storm. She climbed onto the bed and took his hand in both of hers, that same right hand, and it crushed down on her as though it meant to grind her bones to meal, and she let it. "There you are," she said, into the furnace of him. "I have you. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere, and you cannot get rid of me. So, hold on to me. There, hold on." And she held. Through the worst hour of her life she held, while his heart stumbled, and caught, and stumbled again. Under the flat of the hand she'd pressed to his chest, while she poured everything she had down through that terrifying open door, between them. "Steady. Stay with me. You don't have leave to go, until, gods knew how, somewhere near dawn." The storm broke, and set him down on the far side of it, hollow and gray and barely breathing. Alive. Just. She did not let go of his hand until the sun stood full in the window. When he could speak, the first thing he did was close his fingers around her wrist. "Tell no one what this was," he said hoarse. "Not the council, not the guard." A pause, and a thing moved behind his eyes. She couldn't read. "Not Ansel. Especially not Ansel. Do you understand me? It's the poison, not the wound. Someone dosed you. Tell no one." His grip tightened. "Elira. There's a delegation already in this keep. The Frostfell packs, and half my own council already thinks me too weak to keep my crown. If it gets out that I've been poisoned inside my own walls, and cannot name the hand that did it, House Varn will have this throne by month's end, and the border will be at war by the next. I need you to trust me, just once. Say nothing and let me work." It was a good reason. It was such a good reason, and it was also, she saw, watching that careful face, one more door quietly shut against her. One more enormous thing he knew and would not set in her hands. "All right," she said, and she even meant it, for about an hour. But Elira had never once in her life been able to leave a wound unprobed, and there was a very large one festering somewhere beneath her feet in the dark of the Mercy. And by the time the keep had gone quiet again, she was pulling a cloak over her shift and going down the hill in the dark to find it herself. The Mercy at that hour was a different country. The great ward lay dark and breathing with sleepers. The herb store at the back was a black room, full of the smell of her whole life, camphor and dried yarrow, and the Swedish rot from the poison cabinet. She knew it blind. She had meant to go straight to Ansel's shelf, to the sealed jars of the king's tonic, and prove to herself with her own two hands that her master's stores were clean, and then go back up the hill and sleep. There was a lamp already lit at the back. Alira went still in the doorway. Someone stood at Ansel's bench, with the poison cabinet standing open, and a sheaf of papers in one hand, and for one lurching heartbeat, she thought, caught him, the poisoner. Here is the hand at last. And then the figure turned, and the lamp found his face, and it was the king. Severin. Out of the sickbed she'd left him gray and shaking in 18 hours before, upright now with no pain anywhere in the line of him, standing in her master's stores, in the dead of night, with Ansel's private ledgers open in his hands. Neither of them moved. The lamp flame leaned and steadied. Alira, very quiet, very careful, the smooth voice, the one for frightened councilmen. This isn't what it looks like. Then tell me what it is. Her own voice came from very far away, because it looks like the King of Ardenmoor, who cannot lift his sword arm, going through my master's papers at 3 in the morning, by a hooded lamp. So, tell me, what is it? He set the papers down slowly, the way you set down something you don't want to spook. I have been trying to find out who is killing me, he said, for a little over a year. The poison is refined wolfsbane, cut and clarified and dosed so fine that it reads as a failing wound and not a murder. There is perhaps one bench in this whole city with the skill to do that. He didn't look at the bench under his hand. He didn't have to. I had the dregs of a dozen doses tested quietly by a hedge healer in the low city who's never once seen my face. Everyone came back the same. Wolfsbane, thrice clarified, cut with milk thistle so it reads as a wound that simply won't mend. Not a murder anyone would think to look for. There are perhaps 4 people alive with the craft to refine it that fine. 3 of them are dead. The 4th taught the healer who has carried my cup to me every dawn for weeks now. He turned a page without looking at it. Do you know how long it took me to make myself follow that thread to its end? I kept hoping it would run somewhere, anywhere else. It never once did, and the coin that's paid for it, he went on, has been bled out of this house for years. Silver ordered for the mercy that never arrives. Medicines requisitioned twice and sold on once. Supply books that contradict each other so cleanly that no one upstream has ever been able to follow the thread, every copper of it running downhill, in the end, to House Varn. I think the men who've tried to put a blade in me have been carrying Varn's money, he went on, relentless, gentle, terrible. And I think the poison in my blood was refined in this room. Alira, every thread of it runs back to one pair of hands, and they are the hands that raised you. Stop. The word tore out of her. You're wrong. You don't know him. Ansel is not. He wouldn't. She stopped. Because underneath the roar of not Ansel, never Ansel, something cold and quiet had already begun, without her leave, to assemble itself. The tonic sealed in his own hand. The gray that had lifted the moment she'd switched it. 13 years of a man who refused to let anyone touch the king's cup, but her. She stood there in the dark with the smell of her whole life around her, the shelves she'd stalked as a girl, the benches she'd scrubbed on her knees, the poisoned cabinet she'd been taught to fear and respect by the very hands now laid open on the table before her, and felt the floor of 13 years begin, very quietly, to give way beneath her. He held the ledger out then, open, his thumb resting on a line. Look for yourself if you won't take it from me. Silver ordered for the mercy in your master's own hand. 3 years running, delivered nowhere. Signed for, by men who don't exist. And here, another page, on the same nights, those shipments vanished, a cart left the mercies back. Gate for the Varn estates. He has been bleeding your house dry to fund the thing that's been bleeding me, and dressing the theft up as your supply troubles the whole time. The shortages you've cursed for years, the orders that never came, the bandages you rationed. That was him, Alira. You've gone without, so that House Varn could buy the knives meant for my back. No, she would not look at the page. She could not, because she knew that if she looked, some part of her that had trusted that hand for 13 years would begin against her will to read and match the writing and never once be able to unsee it. You could have written any of that. You're the king. You could have a scribe forge me 100 ledgers before breakfast. I could, he agreed quietly. And you'd be right to doubt me. Which is exactly why I never once asked you to take my word for it. Why I did this in the dark, alone, for a year, so that when I finally moved on him, I'd have the thing itself in my hand, and not just my word against a man the whole city loves. He set the ledger down on the bench between them, gently, like an offering. I didn't want it to be him either. He's the nearest thing to a father you have in the world. I know exactly what I'm asking you to lose. Say I'm wrong, she whispered. Look at me and say I'm wrong. He looked at her for a long, long moment. She watched him search for the words, and she watched him fail to find the ones that would let her keep her whole life intact. He did not say she was wrong. She pressed the heels of both hands to her eyes, hard enough to see sparks. When she took them away, her voice had gone very steady, which was how she knew how much trouble she was in. She only ever went that steady over the worst wounds. That's why you kept me, she said. Isn't it? That's the whole of it. You needed someone Ansel trusted, someone he'd raised, who'd walk in and out of his stores, who could carry the king's cup and never once be questioned. And a war orphan with steady hands and no family to make noise if it went wrong, that was as good as you were ever going to get. She looked at him. You named me, your hand, so you could hold Ansel's own apprentice up close to the light and watch what she led you to. She said it without heat, laying the pieces out on the table between them the way she'd lay out instruments before a bad cut. And that was how he knew how deep it had gone. She only ever went cold and orderly like this, over the wounds that were already past saving. A useful orphan. Gods. It's almost elegant. No family to make noise, no one to come asking. The best pair of hands in the house, and all of it wrapped up neat in a nursery story about a bond, so the whole court would swallow it down without chewing. It began that way. He didn't flinch from it, and somehow that was worse than a lie would have been. I won't insult you by pretending otherwise. When you laid hands on me that night, and the whole court started shrieking hold bond, I saw a way to put Ansel's own girl where I could keep her. Yes, that is how it began, Aelira. I swear to you on nothing you'd believe that it is not how it. Why not simply arrest him? She cut in. You're the king if you were so certain. Why the year? Why the games? Why me? Why not have him in a cell? Because being king doesn't make me untouchable. For the first time, the steadiness in him frayed. Ansel holds the loyalty of every healer in Ardenmoor and hath the goodwill of the low city besides. House Varn stands behind him, and a foreign delegation stands in my hall. And if I clap the realm's most beloved healer in irons on a suspicion, with no proof a plain man couldn't argue away, I will look exactly like what Varn has spent 3 years whispering that I am. A weak, frightened boy, king purging the people who frighten him. There'd be blood in the streets by dawn, and a war on the border by spring. I could not move on him until I had a thing not one soul alive could argue with. I'm sorry, I could not. It was a good answer. That was the very worst of it. It was a good answer, and she hated it for being one. You could have told me. Her throat had gone tight. You watched me put my own body between you and that storm. Twice, you let me hold your heart in my hand, while it forgot how to beat. And in the whole of it you never once thought I'd earned the truth? I cleared you the first night, he said, low, in case that matters at all. A plant of Ansel's would never have done the one thing you did, climbed onto a dais, in front of the entire court, and lay both hands on a dying king when standing back. Was safe, and touching him could hang her. You drew every eye in the realm straight onto yourself to save a stranger with nothing on this earth to gain by it. And then you tasted his tonic, and you didn't run to him, and you didn't keep dosing me. You switched it, quiet, and told no one, and watched me get well. His voice cracked, just once. You were the single person in this keep I never had to wonder about. That's why it had to be you. And it's why I couldn't stand to be the one to break your whole world in half. I kept meaning to. I kept not being able to. That isn't a kindness. Her voice stayed low and even. Letting someone go on, believing a lie because the truth's inconvenient to watch land. That's not mercy, Severin. That's cowardice, wearing mercy's coat. You didn't spare me a single thing. You only got to choose the hour I'd find out, and you made certain it was the one that would cost me the most. You knew I loved him. You knew I'd put my body between you and death and do it twice. And you decided, all on your own, that I still couldn't be trusted with the truth of my own life. That's not the crown talking, or the bond, or the poison. That's only what you think I am. He flinched, because none of it was wrong. And there it was, laid out plain, and she could find no crack in any of it, and that was somehow the thing that undid her. Because if he was telling the truth about all of that, then he had wanted her, and it still didn't matter, because underneath, the wanting had always been the using, and she knew, which one the world kept and which one it threw away. Men only ever want my hands, she said, and her voice was terribly quiet now. It's all right, I've always known it. I let myself forget it, for a fortnight, that's all, and that's my fault, and not yours. You needed a good pair of hands, close to a traitor, and mine were the best in the house, and they came without anyone to miss them. She stepped back toward the dark of the doorway. You should have just asked Severin. I'd have said yes. I'd have said yes to being used, if you'd only had the decency to call it what it was. Elira, that is not. Good night, Your Majesty. She walked out into the black corridor and did not let herself run, and behind her she heard him say her name once, cracked, straight down the middle, and she kept walking, because if she stopped she would not start again. She got perhaps 10 paces. Elira. The voice came out of the dark ahead of her, and she knew it, the way she knew her own pulse, and her whole body turned toward it, before her mind had caught up, because there, standing in the mouth of the corridor as though he had been waiting a long while, gray-bearded and broad and steady as the ground itself, was Master Ansel. The man who had pulled her out of the ash, arms already opening. "Child," he said, and his kind old face creased with concern. "You're white as death. What has that man done to you?" Every instinct, she owned, screamed at her to fall into those arms, and that scream was 13 years deep, and she very nearly did. What stopped her was arithmetic. Because Ansel said, gathering her in, murmuring into her hair, "I feared this. I feared it since the night he took you. Come, sit. Tell me all of it." And then he told her things, in that low, grieved, reasonable voice. That the king was not being poisoned at all, whatever he'd claimed, that Severin carried the wasting rot in his blood and had hidden it for years, that he meant, even so, to seal a blood alliance with matriarch Hala's own heir before the week was out, dooming the Frostfell line to carry it home. That a king who would do such a thing was not fit to hold the crown, and would fall, and that good and steady houses stood ready to catch the realm when he did, House Farn among them. "And it cannot come from me," Ansel said gently, holding her at arm's length, his thumbs stroking her shoulders. "I'm only a healer. They'll say I reach above my station. It has to come from someone the matriarch will believe, without a breath of doubt. It has to come from you, child. The king's own hand. If you tell her you have seen the rot in him with your own eyes, not a soul in that room will question it." And Elira, who had gone very still, heard the whole thing land and fall apart at once, because she was the one who had treated the king for a fortnight, and there was no rot in him, none there had never been. The symptoms were bane, because a wasting did not lift the day you changed a man's tonic. because Ansel had just described, in loving detail, symptoms that matched nothing she had ever seen in that sick room, and everything she would invent if she wanted a healthy man, declared a plague carrier before a foreign queen. He was lying to her. The man who raised her was lying to her face, right now, and asking her to carry the lie into the one room where it could start a war, which meant Severin, God's help her, had told the truth. So, she did the only thing a war medic is ever really good for, which is to keep her face steady while the ground gives way. "What do I have to do?" she asked, and let her voice shake, and let the tears come, because they were real, and they were useful, and for once those were the same thing. Ansel's eyes warmed with terrible tenderness. They walked to the East Hall, and it was the longest walk of Alira's life. She had to get into that room and turn her master's own trap inside out, with nothing in her hands but the truth, and one small stoppered jar she'd carried in her cloak since the night she'd switched the tonic. One wrong word, and a good king fell, and a border burned. She had never in her life wanted her hands to be steady so badly. Matriarch Hala of the Frostfell had taken the Great East Hall, and she was a broad, iron-haired woman with a wolf's flat patience, and Severin stood at her right hand, looking like a man walking to his own gallows. He glanced up when Alira came in behind Ansel, and for half a heartbeat, his whole face opened with a wild, foolish hope, and then he saw whose shadow she walked in, and the light in him went out like a snuffed wick, and she understood he thought she had come to bury him. "I'm sorry," she told him, with no words at all. "I should have believed you sooner, Majesty," Ansel said, and bowed to the matriarch, grave and grieved. "It shames me to bring this into your hall, but you deserve the truth of the man you mean to bind your blood to." He laid it all out, the wasting, the concealment, the doomed alliance, and it was a masterwork, patient and sorrowful, and exactly convincing. Then he turned, and the whole room turned with him, to Alira, silent by the door. "The king's own healer will tell you, she has no cause to love me, and every cause to shield the man she serves. Ask her yourself. Do, Alira. Tell the matriarch what you have seen in his body." Every face in the hall swung to her. The matriarch, leaning in, Ansel so certain of her he was already half turned to watch the king fall, and Severin, who thought the last person he'd let close, was about to finish. What 3 years of poison hadn't? She looked at Ansel. "You raised me to see exactly what's wrong with a body," she said. "You never once thought I'd turn it on you." Then she turned to the matriarch. "There is no wasting in the king. There never was. I have treated him myself these past weeks, and what is in his blood is refined wolfsbane, a poison so fine only a master's hands could cut it, dosed into a tonic that came sealed, every dawn, from that man's own bench." She set the little stoppered jar on the table between them. The tainted draught she'd drawn off and kept. "Test it. Test it against anything in the mercy, and see whose stores it matches. And send your own guards. Now, while he stands here in this hall and cannot reach his shelves, to search Master Ansel's stores for a paymaster's ledger from House Varn, and enough refined bane to kill an Alpha King 3 times over." The hall snapped tight as a drawn bow. "This is hysteria," Ansel said, and his voice was still kind, still grieved. But something had gone wrong at the edges of it. "The girl is distraught. The king has clearly turned her." "Then a search costs you nothing," said Matriarch Hala, very quietly, and nodded to her guards. And Ansel's kind old face came apart. The grave, gentle master was gone, and what stood in his place was cornered, and it moved, fast, faster than a healer his age had any right to, straight at Alira with a thin, bright needle sliding out of his sleeve, because if he could not have her word, he could at least have her silence. But this was the one thing in all the Black Night that Alira knew how to do, without thinking. She turned into him instead of away, caught the needle arm at the wrist, and used his own weight and 13 years of knowing exactly how he moved, to put him face down on the stone, with his arm wrenched up behind him, and her knee in his spine. She leaned down close to his ear, and her hands did not shake at all. "You taught these hands everything they know," she said. "You should have remembered what else I learned on the Ashfen line." Then the matriarch's guards had him, and hauled him up, and dragged him out, and it was done. The hall emptied in a low roar. And then it was only the two of them, Elira and a king, staring at her as though he had never once in his life seen her before. "You came to save me," he said. "Even after, you still—" "I came to stop a traitor," she said, flat, and made herself hold his eyes while she said it. That's all it was. Not 1 second of it was forgiveness. She turned for the doors. "You'll make a good king, but I can't trust you, Severine. I don't know that I ever will again." And she saw it land in his face, the understanding that he had broken a thing that does not come back whole, and she walked out before it could break hers. She had been master of the Mercy for 6 months, and she was good at it, and she had always known she would be. The house was a different place now. The crooked supply books ran straight. The silver arrived. Ansel sat in a cell beneath the old fort, while a slow, careful trial unpicked 13 years of rot. And the low city which had loved him was learning to love the plain war orphan who'd cut it out. The king had done that. He'd handed her the whole house without a blink, and named her its master, and then he had spent 5 of those 6 months trying patiently and hopelessly to win her back. The flowers came first. She'd come off a dawn round to find the Mercy's whole front court full of them, and her own healers grinning like fools to see what she'd do. "The infirmary," she'd said, "and the temple. Sick folk can smell them better than I can." He tried the council chamber after that. She sat at the war table twice a week now, over troop numbers and border grain, and he'd catch her eye across it, and his whole face would do something hopeful and uncertain, and she would look back down at the map. He took to finding reasons to linger by the door when she left. "Master Elira, might I have a moment?" She always walked out anyway. The bond did not help her. "Leave a bond open," the old wives said, "and it deepens. Deepen it and it sets." So she kept hers clamped shut behind her ribs, and hoped it would wither from want of tending, and let her go. It did not wither. It sat under her heart, warm and patient and infuriating, exactly where it had always been. And he wrote to her 2 and 3 letters a week, in his own hand, some short, some running for pages, some not even about her at all. A posting he was unsure of, a pension dispute, a border question, as though her plain, honest answer were still a thing he wanted. One read only. "I keep writing the same word 100 different ways. I am sorry. It is a small, stupid word for what I did, and I have no larger one, so I will simply keep sending it." Another, "You said men only ever want your hands. Ansel wanted you small and useful, and certain you are worth nothing but your work, so you'd never once look up from the bench and leave him. He spent 13 years teaching you that, the same way he taught you to set a bone. It was the cruelest thing he did, and he did a great many cruel things. You are not a pair of hands, Elira. You never were, that was the lie. Not me." She read that 1 more times than she'd ever admit. Alone at night, with the bond aching under her ribs, Wick and Tamsin had opinions, of course. "Good," Tamsin said. "Early. Make him crawl. You owe that man precisely nothing." But the line moved as the weeks did. "He sorted the back pay for the whole border watch," Wick said one evening. "And written you, what, 40 letters?" 43, said Tamsin, who apparently counted. By the 5th month, they'd given up subtlety. "Altogether, master," Tamsin said, with respect talk to the man. "You're miserable. He's miserable, and the rest of us have to stand here in the draft between the two of you." "I was used, Tamsin," Elira said, and set down her pen. "I'm not queuing up for a second turn," but it came out with less iron in it than it once had, and Tamsin heard it and had the grace not to smile. Then, in the 6th month, a letter came that was different. Elira, you've made yourself plain, and you've every right to, and I'll respect it. You deserve to do your good work in peace, and not spend your life managing the feelings of the man who wronged you. So I'll stop now. No more letters, no more flowers in your court. I hope you'll believe it was real, at the end, even if it began as a lie. I'm glad the world has you in it. She read it twice. This was, she told herself, exactly what she had wanted for 6 months. So, she could not for her life explain why it felt like a door closing on her, or why she folded it away in the drawer where she kept the other one, or why she slept so badly that night, and the next. He kept his word. No letters came. No flowers. When she passed him in the corridors, he inclined his head. Master even and polite and never once cold. Just done. This is what you wanted, she told herself, and did her work, and did it well, and every single night the warm, patient thread under her ribs stayed precisely where it was, and refused to fade. Until the knock. Wick came into her office, gray-faced, Tamsin at his shoulder, the same color, both of them wearing the particular look of people who have made a very large mistake. "What?" Elira said, slowly rising. "What did you do?" "It's the king," Tamsin said. "He's gone. Not in his chambers, not on the grounds, not anywhere. No horse taken, no guard, no word to a soul. Elira, the trackers had his scent to the east postern, and then it just stopped. The way a scent stops when a man's being careful," she swallowed, "or when he's being carried." And Elira was already moving, already reaching, for the first time since the night she'd walked away from him, for the one thread she'd spent half a year trying to smother, because there was exactly one way left in the world to find him, and she had known it before Tamsin finished the sentence. She pressed a hand flat to her chest, over the bond, and she opened it. It hit her like a door blown off its hinges in a storm. Pain. Deep, drowning, familiar pain. The red hours. The silvered splinter of that first bolt they'd never dared cut so near his heart, flaring somewhere out there in the dark. And, under it, worse, a terrible, clear resolve. He was not being carried anywhere. He had gone off alone, on purpose, into the worst of it. He had felt the storm coming, and he had crept away to ride it out by himself, so that when it took him, he would not reach for her, because she had asked him, at last, to stop reaching. He was somewhere in the city, alone, in the fire, trying with the very last of himself to let go of her hand for good. She followed the bond down through the lower city, like a rope hauling her hand over hand through the dark. It pulled her off the hill, and through the narrow streets where the pre-dawn cold sat thickest, past shuttered stalls and dead lamps, and she ran with her heart in her throat, and Tamsin's voice fading behind her. "Elira, wait, take the guard." And she knew what a fraying thread meant. She'd felt too many go. It brought her, in the end, back to the mercy. Of course it did. She hit the side door low and ready braced for a knife, a body, a varn man, finishing old business, and found none of it. The herb store lay dark and silent, camphor and yarrow, and the sweet rot of the poison cabinet, the room where she'd caught him, the room where all of it had turned. And there on the floor, between the benches, folded down in the dark with his back against her master's ruined shelves, was the king of Ardenmoor. Alone. Gray. Both hands fisted in his own shirt over his heart, riding the storm the way you ride, a thing you have decided to die of quietly, so as not to wake the house. He'd come in the grip of it, to the one place in the whole city that smelled of her. "There you are," she breathed, and dropped to her knees and took his hand. He fought her, not the wild thrash of the red hours, but something worse, a weak and deliberate pulling away, his fingers trying to slide out of hers. "No," he got out through his teeth. "No, I told you I'd stop reaching. You asked me to let." And even now, even drowning, he was trying to keep the one promise she'd wrung out of him, trying to loosen his grip and give her back her hand. "Don't you dare," she said. and close both of hers around it like iron. "Don't you dare let go of me. Hold on. You hold on to me. Do you hear? There. Just here. Just this." And she held him through it, poured herself down the open bond, steady and fierce and unhidden this time. Nothing clamped and nothing denied, until the silver's fire guttered and sank, and the storm set him down at last on the near shore, hollow and shaking and alive. For a while, neither of them could speak. His head came to rest against her shoulder, his breath warm and ragged at her throat, and she felt through the wide open bond exactly what he felt, and there was no mask anywhere in it, only relief and grief, and the plain, helpless, enormous fact of her. Then he stirred and tried, God's help him, to draw his hand out of hers one final time. "You should go," he mumbled. I'll only reach for you again. It isn't fair to you. Go on, Elira. Let go." "No," she said. He went still. "You held on to me first," she said, and her voice cracked, and she let it. "That first night, out of your senses, half dead on my table, you wouldn't let go of my hand, and everyone in that room watched you refuse. Well," she tightened her grip until it must have hurt, "it's my turn, and I'm not letting go first. Not tonight, not tomorrow, not in 50 years. You'll have to be the one to do it, and you won't, because you're a coward about exactly this one thing. And so it turns out am I. So, we're stuck." Her tears fell into his hair. "You wanted the rest of me, not just the hands. You said it in a letter, and I read it 100 times. I'm giving it to you. Don't you dare let go." His hand turned in hers and gripped back hard, and the bond between them flared bright and whole and utterly without artifice. The man who hid everything, hiding nothing at all. She felt all of it come through at once, 6 months of a grief that was the exact twin of her own, the letters and the flowers, and the hope starved quietly because she'd asked it to be. The night he'd watched her switch his tonic and understood she had chosen to save him before she'd even decided to like him. And underneath every scrap of it, steady as a second pulse, laid alongside her own, a wanting that had nothing whatever to do with her hands. It had been true. She had been so busy standing guard over the wound that she'd never once thought to check whether the thing she feared had already happened, whether she had gone and fallen anyway in a sick room over a man who slept better for having her in the room. She had, of course she had. She'd known it on the rampart with the cold milk in her hands, and looked it dead in the eye and called it a kiss. "Marry me," he said into her shoulder, wrecked and hoarse and entirely undignified. "I know I've no right to ask. I'll spend the rest of my life earning it. Marry me, Elira. Ask me again when you can stand up," she said, and felt herself smile for the first time in 6 months. "Ask me tomorrow when you'll remember it. And you'll say yes." She pressed her mouth to his forehead, warm and damp and alive under her lips. "Ask me tomorrow," she said, "and find out." He asked her the next day, standing, sober, both feet under him. He asked her at the war table, until Tamsin threatened to resign in writing. He asked her on the east rampart, with the spiced milk going cold in his hands, and once with so many flowers, the mercy smelled like a festival for a week. And on a perfectly ordinary morning, months on, she looked across a breakfast table at the man, grinning hopefully over the teapot, and she said, yes. The whole city turned out for it, the boy king nobody had thought would last a winter, and the plain war orphan who'd seen the man behind the glass before anyone else had bothered to look. He wept through the vows. She'd known he would. She didn't quite, but it was a near thing, and the bond gave her away anyway, and he laughed at her through his own tears, until she stopped caring who saw. Tamsin, who had counted every last letter, stood up at the feast, and told the whole hall how their master had thrown out 6 months of the man's flowers, and then run half across the lower city. Barefoot, the one night he finally stopped sending them, and the hall roared. Ansel's name was not spoken. His trial had ended quietly. Weeks before, Housefarn had folded the moment the ledgers came to light. The border stayed shut, and the Frostfell stayed friends. All of it was real, and none of it was what she'd remember of the day. "You're stuck with me now," he murmured when it was done, his hand wrapped fast around hers. "No letting go, no taking it back." "I'm the one who wouldn't let go first, if you'll recall," she said. "Try to keep up." "Best thing that ever happened to me," he said, "was a healer with ice for blood who climbed up onto my table and refused to do the safe thing." She kissed him, there in front of the whole city, and for once in her life, she didn't argue.